When people hear the word slavery, most images come prepackaged. Chains, whips, ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean, cotton fields under a burning sun. These images are real, painful, and historically important, but they represent only a portion of a much larger human story and not the beginning of it. Long before the Atlantic slave trade, long before European ships reached African shores, long before race became the defining line of enslavement, slavery already existed, deeply rooted in Europe itself. To understand how the Catholic Church became involved in slavery, we must first remove a modern assumption, the idea that slavery was always controversial or clearly immoral. For most of ancient and medieval history, slavery was not seen as a moral problem. It was seen as a normal part of life, woven into society so completely that few people could imagine a world without it. This is the world in which Christianity was born. Christianity did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged inside the Roman Empire, one of the largest, most organized slave societies in human history. Rome did not merely tolerate slavery, it depended on it. Without enslaved labor, Rome could not function. In Roman cities, enslaved people cooked meals, cleaned homes, carried water, and maintained public baths. In rural areas, they worked massive estates owned by wealthy elites. In mines, enslaved laborers dug for silver, iron, and salt under conditions so harsh that death was common. On construction sites, enslaved workers built roads, aqueducts, and monuments that still stand today. Some enslaved people were educated and skilled. They served as tutors, accountants, doctors, and scribes. Others were treated as expendable tools, worked until their bodies collapsed and then replaced. Roman law defined enslaved people as things, not persons. They could be bought, sold, rented, punished, or killed by their owners with little legal consequence. This was not considered cruel by Roman standards. It was simply the way the world worked. Children grew up seeing slavery everywhere. Philosophers justified it, laws protected it, economies depended on it, religion did not challenge it. And this is the environment into which early Christianity appeared. The earliest Christians were not lawmakers, generals, or emperors. They were ordinary people, fishermen, laborers, women, migrants, and the poor. They lived under Roman authority and Roman law. They had no power to dismantle social institutions, even if they wanted to. So early Christian leaders made a choice, not necessarily out of cruelty, but out of survival. They did not call for the abolition of slavery. Instead, they taught enslaved people how to endure it. Early Christian writings instruct slaves to obey their masters faithfully, even when those masters were harsh. Masters were encouraged to show restraint and kindness, but not to free their slaves. The system itself was never directly challenged. The promise Christianity offered was not liberation in this life, but salvation in the next. Equality was preached, but it was spiritual, not social. In simple terms, Christianity taught that all souls were equal before God, while accepting that bodies could remain unequal on earth. This distinction mattered deeply. It allowed believers to feel morally righteous while leaving unjust systems intact. Slavery was not condemned, it was spiritualized. This approach allowed Christianity to spread rapidly through Roman society without threatening its foundations. The faith adapted to the world as it was, rather than demanding the world change. As Christianity grew, it attracted not only the poor but also the wealthy and powerful. By the 4th century, everything changed. Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity, and later emperors made it the official religion of the Roman Empire. Suddenly, Christianity was no longer a persecuted movement, it was an institution tied to power. And with power came inheritance. The Church inherited Roman administrative structures, it inherited Roman legal traditions, and it inherited Roman assumptions about slavery. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire did not end slavery, it transformed it. As imperial authority weakened, political chaos spread across Europe. Kingdoms rose and fell, borders shifted, violence became common. In this unstable world, the Catholic Church became one of the few stable institutions that remained. The Church preserved literacy, it preserved records, it preserved land ownership, and it preserved labor systems. Large estates once owned by Roman elites passed into Church hands, donated by wealthy believers seeking spiritual favor or salvation. These estates did not come empty, they came with people. enslaved laborers, bound workers, families tied to land they could not leave. The church did not question this inheritance, it accepted it. Over time, slavery in Europe began to change form. In many regions, outright chattel slavery slowly evolved into serfdom, a system where people were bound to land rather than owned outright. But this was not freedom. Serfs could not leave their land without permission. They owed labor, crops, and obedience to their lords. In many church-controlled lands, this system flourished. Monasteries required workers to farm crops, tend animals, brew beer, copy manuscripts, and maintain buildings. All of this labor came from people with no real freedom to refuse. From the church's perspective, this was not exploitation, it was order. Slavery and bonded labor were seen as part of God's design for society, a hierarchy where everyone had a role. Kings ruled, priests prayed, laborers worked, enslaved people obeyed. This worldview did not emerge overnight. It was built slowly, reinforced by tradition, theology, and convenience. Over generations, slavery became invisible not because it disappeared, but because it was normalized. Children born into bondage grew up knowing no alternative. Clergy raised within the system saw it as natural. Documents recorded enslaved people as assets, not individuals, and moral questions were rarely asked. This is the foundation upon which everything else rests. Before popes issued decrees, before monasteries openly owned slaves, before colonial expansion carried slavery across oceans, the moral door had already been left open. Slavery survived not because people constantly defended it, but because they stopped questioning it. And once an injustice becomes normal, it can last for centuries. This quiet acceptance, formed in the earliest days of Christian Europe, shaped the Church's relationship with power, labor, and human freedom. It set the stage for what would come next, a period when the Church would not merely tolerate slavery, but actively participate in it. As Christianity settled into its new role as an official and eventually dominant force in Europe, its leaders faced a difficult reality. They were now responsible not only for souls, but for land, order, and stability. The Church was no longer operating on the margins of society, it was shaping society. And that meant answering uncomfortable questions. One of those questions was slavery. Early church thinkers, often called the Church Fathers, wrote extensively about morality, behavior, and social order. Their writings shaped Christian thinking for centuries, but when it came to slavery, their words reveal something striking: discomfort, yes, but not rejection. Many church fathers acknowledged that slavery was harsh and painful. Some even described it as a result of human sin, but very few argued that it should be abolished. Instead, they framed slavery as a consequence of a fallen world, something unfortunate but unavoidable. In this way, slavery was morally softened without being removed. The argument went something like this: slavery was not part of God's original design, but since the world was broken by sin, slavery existed as a form of punishment or discipline. Therefore, enslaved people were encouraged to accept their condition patiently, as suffering that could lead to spiritual reward. This idea was powerful and dangerous. It transformed bondage into something almost sacred. Suffering was no longer just endured, it was given meaning, and once suffering is given meaning, it becomes much harder to challenge. Some church leaders went further. They argued that slavery actually benefited enslaved people by exposing them to Christianity. In this reasoning, slavery became a tool for salvation. Enslavement was not just tolerated, it was rebranded as spiritually useful. This logic would echo loudly in later centuries. As these ideas spread, they shaped how clergy viewed their responsibilities. Priests and bishops were taught to care for the souls of enslaved people, not to question the system that enslaved them. Spiritual guidance replaced social reform. By focusing on individual morality rather than structural injustice, the Church avoided confrontation with powerful elites and later became one of them. As church authority grew, so did its wealth. Donations poured in from kings, nobles, and wealthy families seeking favor, forgiveness, or eternal reward. Land was gifted to monasteries and bishoprics on a massive scale. And land always came with labor. These donations often included not just fields and buildings, but entire communities of people bound to that land. When a noble donated an estate to the church, the workers on that land were transferred as well without consent, without negotiation. The church accepted these gifts without hesitation. From the church's perspective, this was practical. Estates needed workers, monasteries needed food, clergy needed income to support religious life, charity, and expansion. The labor system was already in place. Why dismantle it? Over time, church ownership of land rivaled, and sometimes exceeded, that of kings. By the early Middle Ages, some monasteries controlled thousands of acres. They operated farms, mills, vineyards, and workshops. They traded goods across regions. They functioned as economic centers. None of this was possible without coerced labor. Slaves, serfs, and bonded workers became an invisible foundation beneath the church's spiritual authority. They plowed fields, harvested crops, repaired buildings, brewed beer, and produced manuscripts, often without pay, choice, or freedom. And because this labor was tied to religion, it gained an added layer of legitimacy. Obedience was no longer just social, it was spiritual. Disobedience was not only defiance of an owner, it could be framed as defiance of God's order. This blending of theology and hierarchy created a powerful system. It discouraged rebellion, it normalized inequality, and it taught generations that suffering in silence was virtuous. Meanwhile, church law, known as canon law, developed alongside secular law. Canon law addressed marriage, inheritance, discipline, and behavior, but it did not challenge slavery as an institution. Instead, it regulated it. Rules were created about baptizing enslaved people, marrying them, disciplining them, and punishing them. Slavery was assumed. The law focused on managing enslaved lives, not freeing them. This is a crucial point. When an institution writes laws about how to treat enslaved people instead of whether they should be enslaved at all, it reveals acceptance, not resistance. By the early medieval period, slavery had become so embedded in church-controlled society that it was rarely questioned. It was taught, it was recorded, it was inherited. Children born to enslaved parents inherited their status. Families remained bound across generations. Freedom became rare and conditional. And because the church preserved literacy and record-keeping, it preserved these systems with remarkable efficiency. Church archives contain lists of enslaved people, labor obligations, and transfers of ownership. These documents are quiet, bureaucratic, emotionless. But behind each line of ink was a human life. A person who could not choose where to live. A person who could not choose their work. A person whose suffering was justified as part of divine order. By the time Europe entered the High Middle Ages, the moral foundation had fully hardened. Slavery and bonded labor were no longer debated, they were assumed. The church did not see itself as cruel, it saw itself as orderly, responsible, necessary. And that self-image made change almost impossible. Because once an institution believes its power is divinely sanctioned, questioning it feels like heresy, not justice. This mindset would follow the church into the next phase of its history, when European expansion, conquest, and colonization would push these old ideas onto a global stage. And when that happened, slavery would not disappear. It would spread. As centuries passed, slavery and bonded labor were no longer just economic systems. They became cultural truths. People were born into them, raised within them, and taught to accept them as part of the natural world. By this point, most Europeans could not imagine society functioning any other way. And the church played a central role in shaping that imagination. During the medieval period, the Catholic Church controlled education. Monasteries and cathedral schools were the primary centers of learning. Clergy were the scholars, teachers, and record keepers of Europe. What they taught, and what they did not teach, shaped how people understood morality. Students learned theology, philosophy, and scripture. They studied obedience, hierarchy, and divine order. They were taught that God created a structured universe where everyone had a place. Kings ruled by divine will. Priests mediated between heaven and earth. Laborers worked the land, and those at the bottom obeyed. This hierarchy was not presented as injustice, it was presented as harmony. Questioning one's place in society was often framed as pride or rebellion. Accepting suffering patiently was praised as humility, and humility was one of the highest Christian virtues. This moral framework had a powerful effect on how slavery was viewed. Enslaved people were encouraged to see their condition not as theft of freedom, but as a test of faith. Their suffering, they were told, could bring spiritual reward if endured without complaint. Freedom was postponed, justice was delayed, hope was redirected toward heaven. Meanwhile, church leaders taught that social stability was a moral good. Disorder, rebellion, and upheaval were seen as threats not only to society, but to God's plan. Slavery, harsh as it was viewed as preferable to chaos. This belief helped justify silence. Even when clergy witnessed cruelty, they often responded by addressing individual behavior rather than the system itself. A cruel master might be advised to be gentler, an abused slave might be encouraged to pray more. The structure remained untouched. Over time, this approach hardened into tradition. The church also played a major role in shaping law and custom. Canon law influenced secular rulers, and secular law reinforced church teachings. Together, they created a legal environment where enslaved people had little protection and even less voice. Freedom, when granted, was treated as a gift, not a right. Some enslaved people were freed as acts of charity, especially near the death of an owner. These acts were praised as virtuous, but they did not challenge the system. In fact, they reinforced it by framing freedom as something bestowed by the powerful, not something inherently deserved. This dynamic created a dangerous illusion that slavery could coexist with morality. As long as occasional kindness existed, the system itself was allowed to continue. At the same time, the church's growing wealth further tied it to these labor systems. Monasteries expanded, new religious orders formed, cathedrals were built across Europe, many of them taking decades or even centuries to complete. These massive projects required enormous amounts of labor. Stone had to be quarried, timber had to be cut, fields had to be farmed to feed workers, manuscripts had to be copied, candles had to be made, wine had to be produced. Behind the beauty of medieval Christianity, the soaring cathedrals, the illuminated manuscripts, the chants and rituals, was a vast, unseen workforce of people with little or no freedom. Their labor was sanctified by purpose. Because the work served God, it was framed as noble. Because the institution was holy, its methods were rarely questioned. This blending of sacred purpose and forced labor made resistance difficult. To resist the church was not merely to resist an employer, it was to resist divine authority. For enslaved people, rebellion carried not only physical risk but spiritual condemnation. Disobedience could be framed as sin, escape could be framed as moral failure, submission became a religious duty. Even for free people, questioning slavery was risky. The church shaped moral discourse so completely that alternatives were hard to articulate. Without language to describe injustice, injustice survives unchallenged. By the late medieval period, slavery and serfdom were so normalized that they barely registered as moral issues. They were facts of life, like disease, famine, or war. And like those forces, they were often seen as unavoidable. This long period of acceptance is critical to understanding what came next, because when Europe began to expand outward, exploring, conquering, and colonizing, it carried these ideas with it. The theology had already been written. The hierarchy had already been justified. The moral compromises had already been made. All that remained was scale. When Europeans encountered new lands and new peoples, they did not invent new justifications for enslavement. They reused old ones, they simply applied them to unfamiliar faces. The belief that some people were destined to serve others. The idea that suffering could be spiritually beneficial. The assumption that conversion mattered more than freedom. These ideas had been tested and normalized for centuries inside Europe. So when the world grew larger, slavery grew with it. And the church, shaped by its past, was prepared to follow. At several moments in history, the church stood at a crossroads. These were moments when slavery could have been openly challenged, when moral authority could have been used to disrupt an unjust system. The church had influence over kings, shaped law, and guided the conscience of millions. If any institution had the power to question slavery, it was the church. But again and again, those moments passed. Not because church leaders were unaware of suffering, they saw it every day. They heard confessions, they witnessed punishment, they knew that enslaved people lived and died without freedom. The issue was not ignorance, it was hesitation. Slavery was too deeply woven into society to confront without consequences. Challenging slavery would have meant challenging land ownership, wealth distribution, and political alliances. It would have required confronting kings and nobles whose power depended on forced labor. It would have threatened the church's own economic foundations. So instead of confrontation, the church chose accommodation. This choice was rarely stated openly. It did not appear in bold declarations. It lived in silence, in omission, in careful language that avoided disruption. Over time, this silence became tradition. And tradition has power. What began as reluctance slowly transformed into justification. What began as tolerance slowly hardened into acceptance. Eventually, acceptance became doctrine, not always written, but deeply believed. The church increasingly framed social hierarchy as part of divine will. Inequality was not accidental, it was purposeful. Some were born to rule, others were born to labor, and some, it was implied, were born to obey. This worldview did not require cruelty to function, it only required distance. When enslaved people were seen primarily as labor rather than as individuals, moral concern faded. Their suffering became abstract. Their lives were reduced to categories: worker, servant, dependent. This distance made it easier to rationalize injustice. Church sermons emphasized patience, obedience, and humility. These were powerful virtues, but when preached selectively, they became tools of control. Enslaved people were taught to endure. Masters were rarely taught to relinquish power. Freedom was spiritualized, justice was postponed. In many cases, clergy genuinely believed they were doing good. They provided food, shelter, and religious instruction. They baptized enslaved people and taught them prayers. They offered comfort in suffering. But comfort is not the same as justice. By focusing on spiritual care while ignoring structural harm, the church allowed slavery to continue with a clean conscience. The system was cruel, but the intentions were framed as compassionate. This moral split, caring for souls while exploiting bodies, became one of the defining contradictions of medieval Christianity. Over generations, this contradiction stopped feeling like a contradiction at all. Children born into the church's world learned that slavery simply existed. It was not debated, it was not explained, it was assumed. Like feudal loyalty or divine monarchy, it was part of the natural order. Once something becomes natural, it no longer feels wrong. This is how injustice survives long periods of time, not through constant violence, but through normalization. The church also benefited from another powerful force: habit. Institutions rely on continuity. They resist change because change creates uncertainty. For centuries, church administration, land management, and economic planning had relied on bonded labor. Removing it would have required reimagining everything. So instead, the church refined the system. Rules were created to define obligations. Calendars were structured around labor cycles. Punishments were standardized. Expectations were clarified. Slavery became bureaucratic. And bureaucracy, by its nature, hides suffering behind process. When slavery is managed through records and routines, it loses its emotional weight. It becomes paperwork, numbers, transactions. In church archives, enslaved people appear as entries in ledgers. Names are sometimes listed but rarely stories. Labor obligations are recorded precisely. Humanity is absent. This is not accidental. Systems function best when they reduce people to roles. The longer this system operated, the harder it became to imagine alternatives. Even reformers within the church struggled to articulate a vision without slavery. They criticized abuse, not bondage itself. They asked for kindness, not freedom. And so, centuries passed. Wars came and went. Plagues swept across Europe. Empires collapsed. New kingdoms formed. Through all of it, slavery and bonded labor endured, reshaped, renamed, but never dismantled. The church adapted to every historical change, but on this issue it remained largely unmoved. This long period of moral stillness shaped the church's identity. It learned to coexist with injustice without feeling responsible for it. It learned to speak about love while benefiting from coercion. It learned to preach universal dignity while practicing selective freedom. These habits would not disappear overnight. They would travel. When Europe began to look outward, toward Africa, Asia, and the Americas, it carried this moral framework with it. The Church did not approach the wider world as a blank slate. It arrived with centuries of assumptions already in place. Assumptions about hierarchy, assumptions about obedience, assumptions about whose suffering mattered. Slavery, already justified at home, was now ready for export. And the Church, shaped by centuries of silence, was prepared to bless what came next. By the time Europe entered the early Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had become something unprecedented. It was no longer simply a religious institution guiding belief and worship. It had become one of the largest economic powers on the continent. Land was the source of wealth in medieval Europe, and the Church owned vast amounts of it. Kings donated land to the Church in exchange for legitimacy. Nobles donated land to secure prayers for their souls. Wealthy families donated estates hoping to reduce punishment in the afterlife. Over generations, these gifts accumulated. The result was staggering. Monasteries controlled farms, forests, vineyards, mills, and entire villages. Bishoprics governed wide territories. Some church institutions owned more land than local rulers, and all of this land required labor to remain productive. That labor did not come from free workers in the modern sense. It came from people who were bound. When land was transferred to the Church, the people living on that land were transferred with it. Their status did not change. They did not get a choice. They simply belonged to a new master, one clothed in religious authority. From the Church's perspective, this was practical. Estates needed to function. Food had to be grown, buildings had to be maintained, revenue had to be generated to support clergy, charity, and expansion. But practicality does not erase injustice. These workers plowed fields owned by monasteries. They harvested crops for abbeys. They repaired church buildings. They paid rents, taxes, or labor dues to religious authorities who controlled their lives. Some were legally enslaved. Others were serfs bound to the land. The distinctions mattered on paper, but in daily life, freedom was still out of reach. They could not leave without permission. They could not choose their work. They could not refuse labor demands. And the Church accepted this system as normal. Religious leaders rarely asked whether it was right to own people's labor indefinitely. Instead, they focused on ensuring productivity, discipline, and order. Church estates were often better organized than secular ones. Records were kept carefully. Labor obligations were tracked precisely. Punishments were regulated. This efficiency gave the system legitimacy. If something is orderly, it feels justified. If something functions smoothly, it feels necessary. Over time, the Church's role as a slave-owning and labor-controlling institution became routine. It was no longer shocking, it was expected. And because the Church was seen as morally superior, its participation made the system appear morally acceptable. If the Church owned bonded workers, then slavery could not be sinful. If monks depended on forced labor, then forced labor must be compatible with holiness. This logic was never shouted, it was absorbed quietly. Monasteries were not just centers of prayer and worship. They were also hubs of production, trade, and economic power. Many of the largest monasteries controlled hundreds, sometimes thousands of acres. They had workshops, mills, vineyards, fields, and forests, and behind all of this activity was labor, mostly coerced labor. The people working these lands were rarely free. They were either outright slaves, inherited as property from donors, or serfs, bound to the land for life. Their lives were governed by the rhythms of the estate and the expectations of the monks or abbots who oversaw them. Daily life for these workers was grueling. From sunrise to sunset, they labored in fields, harvested crops, tended livestock, repaired buildings, and maintained roads and aqueducts. In workshops, they crafted tools, prepared food, or copied manuscripts. Each task, each hour was monitored. Rules were strict. Punishments were meted out for mistakes, for perceived laziness, or for minor infractions. Discipline was harsh but considered necessary to keep the estate productive. Yet all of this labor was framed in religious terms. The Church taught that obedience to one's earthly master was obedience to God. To question orders, to resist labor, or to complain about conditions was framed as sinful. Faith and submission were intertwined, and spiritual language was used as a tool to demand compliance. Workers were encouraged to pray for patience and endurance, to accept their station as God's will, and to view suffering as spiritually beneficial. This moral framing had a profound psychological effect. It normalized bondage and made rebellion not just dangerous physically but dangerous spiritually. To resist was not only socially risky but morally wrong. Monasteries also exercised power over the smaller communities surrounding them. People living nearby were often compelled to provide labor for church projects, building roads, maintaining dikes, or working in monastery fields during peak agricultural seasons. These demands were justified as communal service, but in practice they were extensions of the church's labor system, coercive and controlled. Even in cases where enslaved or bound workers converted to Christianity or participated in monastic rituals, their status remained unchanged. Baptism, prayer, and participation in religious life did not free them. Spiritual inclusion did not translate to social or economic freedom. Faith was emphasized, liberty was postponed. In addition to daily labor, monasteries often required extra contributions in the form of produce, taxes, or goods. These could include wheat, wine, honey, or handcrafted items. For families bound to church lands, obligations were relentless. Survival depended not only on hard work, but also on compliance with a moral order that was designed to sustain the church's power. Yet despite the oppression, some individuals found solace in spiritual life. Religious instruction, community rituals, and access to church charity offered limited protection and comfort. But these small benefits did not counterbalance the systemic denial of freedom. They were moral palliatives, not justice. By controlling both the spiritual and economic lives of workers, monasteries created an environment where slavery and bonded labor could continue largely unquestioned. Obedience was taught as virtue, authority was framed as divinely sanctioned, and the moral voice of the church reinforced the social and economic structure that kept millions in subjugation. Over time, this became the church's standard model. Economic wealth built upon labor that was not freely given, moral authority maintained through spiritual justification, and social order enforced through a combination of law, tradition, and religious teaching. This was the institutionalization of slavery within the church, a system that had grown organically over centuries, but now operated with bureaucracy, theology, and moral legitimacy working together. As the church solidified its position as both spiritual and temporal authority, its leaders increasingly codified rules regarding slavery. Slavery was no longer just tolerated, it was officially regulated. Papal letters, decrees, and canon law established the framework for how enslaved people were to be treated, transferred, and incorporated into church estates. Historical records show that popes, bishops, and abbots routinely received enslaved people as gifts. Kings and nobles often presented enslaved individuals to monasteries or cathedrals as part of larger donations of land or wealth. These gifts were formalized in legal documents, listed alongside fields, livestock, and buildings. Enslaved people were treated as property, assets to be managed, but under the moral authority of the church. At times, popes themselves issued directives that confirmed the legality of owning enslaved people. While some decrees included protections for enslaved individuals, ensuring they were not killed unnecessarily or that they were allowed to practice their faith, the fundamental principle remained: they were property and their labor was expected. The church legitimized slavery while simultaneously introducing regulations that gave it a veneer of morality. In canon law, enslaved people were categorized and accounted for meticulously. Monastic records contain lists of names, ages, tasks, and labor obligations. Some documents even note the sale or transfer of enslaved people between church institutions. Legal language framed these transactions as orderly and just. Humanity was stripped from the system and replaced by categories, numbers, and obligations. This legal recognition was essential. It not only solidified the church's own labor system, but also shaped European society at large. By embedding slavery within religious law, the church helped normalize it across secular communities. People saw that the highest moral authority in the land endorsed slavery. Resistance became not only socially and economically risky, but morally confusing. If the church permitted it, how could it be sinful? Over time, church-sanctioned slavery expanded beyond European borders. As European powers began to explore and colonize Africa and the Americas, the church followed. Missionaries traveled with explorers, settlers, and traders. Catholic institutions often benefited directly from colonial economies built on enslaved labor. Some religious orders owned plantations in the Americas, using enslaved Africans to produce crops such as sugar, coffee, and tobacco. Enslaved people could be baptized and incorporated into the church spiritually, but this did not change their social status. Spiritual inclusion coexisted with material subjugation. Conversion to Christianity was not a pathway to freedom, it was sometimes a tool to reinforce obedience. Even within Europe, the Church's approach to enslaved people remained remarkably consistent over centuries. The balance between spiritual care and structural subjugation became institutionalized. Acts of charity or instruction were presented as moral good, but they did not question the ownership of human beings. This duality, compassion for souls combined with acceptance of bondage, was central to the Church's identity. By framing slavery as part of God's plan, necessary for social order and manageable through regulation, the Church could participate in coercive labor while maintaining moral authority. This period of formalization and legal recognition would have lasting consequences. By embedding slavery within religious, moral, and legal systems, the Church made it nearly invisible to contemporaries and morally complex for future generations to challenge. And while some voices within the Church objected to cruelty or poor treatment, they were rarely strong enough to question the system as a whole. Regulations often improved conditions in small ways, but the core structure of bondage, sanctioned, recorded, and justified, remained intact. By the late Middle Ages, the Church had effectively become a central institution in Europe not just of spiritual guidance, but of labor control. Its authority, wealth, and influence were inseparable from the system of coerced work that sustained it. Slavery was not a side effect of power. It was intertwined with power, faith, and law. And this entanglement would follow the Church into the age of exploration, colonization, and the transatlantic slave trade, where centuries of precedent would shape global systems of enslavement. By the High Middle Ages, the Church's involvement in slavery was no longer incidental, it was integral. But how did an institution preaching love, mercy, and the equality of souls reconcile that with the ownership of human beings? The answer lies in theology, moral reasoning, and centuries of intellectual framing. Church leaders relied on scripture, philosophy, and legal precedent to construct moral justifications for slavery. They did not invent slavery, it existed long before Christianity. Instead, they interpreted it through the lens of faith, crafting arguments that allowed it to coexist with Christian morality. One common justification involved the treatment of prisoners of war. The Church taught that enemies captured in battle could be enslaved. This was rooted in both Roman law and biblical interpretation. Certain passages in Scripture were cited to support the idea that subjugating enemies was permissible, even divinely sanctioned, if it served God's order. Another justification relied on religion and difference. Non-Christians, particularly those outside Europe, were often deemed morally or spiritually inferior. This mindset, reinforced by centuries of teachings and reinforced by colonial expansion, allowed the Church to rationalize the enslavement of outsiders. Conversion was seen as a moral good, but it did not automatically free an enslaved person. Faith, obedience, and labor could coexist. Even within Europe, the Church argued that some people were naturally destined for servitude. Influential thinkers suggested that social hierarchies reflected divine order. Kings, nobles, priests, and laborers each had their God-given place. This concept of natural hierarchy extended to slavery. The idea was that some individuals, by birth or circumstance, were meant to serve others, not because they were evil, but because this was part of God's plan. This reasoning became deeply embedded in canon law, papal decrees, and local practice. Slavery was not condemned, it was regulated. Rules were issued for humane treatment, for ensuring religious instruction, for limiting abuse, but the system itself was never fundamentally questioned. Even moral concern was compartmentalized. Clergy could preach charity, mercy, and care for the poor, including enslaved people, without challenging the ownership system. The institution could appear compassionate while simultaneously benefiting from coercion. Spiritual care became a mechanism for moral justification rather than liberation. By framing slavery in moral and religious terms, the Church created a paradox. It taught the inherent dignity of the human soul while permitting, and often profiting from, the loss of bodily freedom. This paradox was accepted as a necessary tension, an uncomfortable truth that few dared to confront. Throughout Europe, this framework shaped daily life. Enslaved people were encouraged to accept their condition with patience and prayer. Obedience was elevated to a spiritual virtue. Punishment for disobedience was framed as both social necessity and moral correction. Compliance became intertwined with salvation. Church writings from this period are full of subtle guidance. Slaves should obey masters, masters should be fair, but the institution itself, the church, the abbey, the diocese, remained the overarching authority. Freedom was not a right. It was an occasional gift, a concession granted at the discretion of the powerful. Even critics within the church focused more on cruelty than on the system itself. Abusive treatment could be condemned, ownership of human beings could not. And over generations, this distinction hardened into doctrine by habit, precedent, and repetition. By the late medieval period, the Church had successfully created a moral and theological scaffolding for slavery. Spiritual authority, legal recognition, and intellectual justification all aligned to make ownership of human beings seem natural, necessary, and even virtuous. This framework would not remain confined to Europe. With the dawn of exploration and colonization, these ideas would travel across oceans, reinforcing and legitimizing global systems of slavery in ways that would last for centuries. The Catholic Church's moral and legal justification of slavery was not abstract. It was written, documented, and enforced through official letters, decrees, and papal bulls. These documents reveal the Church's evolving position not as a reluctant bystander, but as an active participant in shaping the moral and legal framework of slavery. One of the earliest examples comes from the 15th century. As European powers began to explore and conquer territories in Africa, the Church issued directives concerning the treatment of newly encountered peoples. Popes like Nicholas V issued bulls that explicitly granted Christian rulers the right to subjugate non-Christian peoples. These documents often used religious language, framing conquest and enslavement as a means to convert souls and expand Christendom. The logic was precise. Enslaving non-Christians was permissible because it introduced them to Christianity. Conversion, obedience, and labor could coexist. Spiritual salvation was prioritized over earthly freedom. These papal letters were not marginal statements. They carried the full authority of the Church, providing both moral and legal sanction to kings, explorers, and colonial administrators. At the same time, theological debates within the Church grappled with the ethics of slavery. Some theologians questioned the morality of enslaving fellow humans. They argued that all people, regardless of faith, were made in the image of God and deserved dignity. These debates were real, and in some cases they influenced rules regarding the treatment of enslaved people, for example, prohibiting extreme cruelty, encouraging humane treatment, or ensuring the right to religious instruction. Yet these debates rarely challenged the system itself. The ownership of enslaved people remained unquestioned. Moral concern was often restricted to the quality of treatment rather than the legitimacy of enslavement. Compassion could exist alongside coercion, creating a paradox the Church accepted as necessary. Local bishops, abbots, and clergy carried out these policies in their jurisdictions. They recorded transfers of enslaved people, ensured labor obligations were met, and monitored compliance with church-sanctioned rules. They encouraged enslaved individuals to embrace Christianity, attend religious instruction, and submit to spiritual and temporal authority. Obedience was both a duty and a path to salvation. These actions reinforced the Church's broader theological message. Slavery was not inherently sinful, provided it was regulated and morally managed. Spiritual authority, legal recognition, and moral justification all aligned to make the ownership of human beings compatible with Christian ethics. Meanwhile, dissenting voices, though present, were marginalized. Individuals who objected to the cruelty of slavery or questioned its legitimacy often faced institutional resistance. Their influence was limited because the system was already deeply embedded in the Church's economic, social, and moral structures. Institutional inertia, tradition, and the desire for social stability outweighed calls for fundamental reform. By the time European nations began establishing colonies in the Americas, these centuries-old doctrines had been transporting overseas. The Church's moral scaffolding traveled with explorers, missionaries, and colonial administrators. Papal bulls were cited to justify conquest and enslavement. Theological reasoning was invoked to rationalize labor systems that were brutal and exploitative. Conversion and obedience were used to obscure the violence of bondage. In this way, the Church's role was both ideological and practical. It provided a moral framework that legitimized slavery, while its institutions and documents facilitated the management and control of enslaved populations. Spiritual authority reinforced social hierarchy, while legal authority ensured compliance. Together, these forces created a system in which slavery could persist for centuries without significant challenge. Even today, historians recognize the importance of this combination, moral justification paired with institutional control. It was not merely the presence of coercion that sustained slavery, but the ability of the Church to frame it as divinely sanctioned, morally acceptable, and legally legitimate. This alignment of theology, law, and administration ensured that the practice would endure, both in Europe and around the world, for generations to come. Even within an institution as vast and hierarchical as the Catholic Church, not everyone agreed with the practices surrounding slavery. Across Europe, from monasteries to cathedral chapters, individual clergy, monks, and lay brothers sometimes voiced discomfort or concern, yet their actions were constrained by centuries of precedent, moral framing, and institutional pressure. Some monks, for example, argued that enslaved people should be treated with greater dignity. They emphasized spiritual instruction, humane treatment, and the provision of food, clothing, and shelter. In certain monastic communities, enslaved individuals were allowed to participate in religious life, attend services, and even receive sacramental guidance, all steps intended to acknowledge their spiritual equality. Yet even the most compassionate clerics rarely questioned the system itself. Improving conditions, they reasoned, was sufficient. Freedom in their worldview was not a right but a privilege occasionally granted. Their moral compass extended to alleviating suffering, not dismantling ownership. There were rare cases where clergy sought to free individuals. Documents from some abbeys reveal donations explicitly stipulating manumission, the granting of freedom, to certain enslaved workers. Such acts were celebrated within the Church as virtuous deeds, yet these examples were exceptional and symbolic. They were praised for their morality precisely because they did not challenge the larger system. A single act of liberation became a moral highlight, while the institution itself remained intact. Meanwhile, dissenting voices were often muted by the weight of hierarchy. Bishops, abbots, and papal authority had centuries of law, custom, and theology behind them. They held economic power, spiritual authority, and social influence. A monk criticizing slavery risked censure, marginalization, or isolation. The institutional momentum was simply too great to overcome on an individual scale. This dynamic created a culture of quiet moral compromise. Clergy could exercise compassion, perform acts of charity, and speak against extreme cruelty, yet the Church as an institution continued to benefit from coerced labor. Personal virtue existed alongside structural injustice. The two were not seen as contradictory because moral responsibility was narrowly defined. Care for the soul, not the body. In some cases, ethical tension became visible. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries revealed debates within religious orders about the treatment of enslaved individuals. Questions arose: could laborers refuse certain tasks? Should conversion confer freedom? Were harsh punishments justified? These debates illustrate that some within the Church wrestled with the moral implications of bondage. Yet even when questions were raised, solutions were limited to incremental reform. Policies might regulate hours, prescribe fair treatment, or ensure religious instruction, but ownership itself was never seriously challenged. Slavery had been normalized over centuries, moral imagination had been constrained. Individual courage could mitigate cruelty, but it could not dismantle the system. This pattern repeated across Europe. Wealthy monasteries continued to rely on bound labor to sustain large estates. Cathedrals built over decades depended on the work of those with no freedom to refuse. Church-sanctioned rules ensured obedience and moral legitimacy. The few acts of compassion or manumission were exceptions, absorbed into the broader narrative as signs of church virtue, rather than signs of systemic failure. By the time European powers expanded globally, the Church's centuries of precedent had become a toolkit for colonization. Individual dissenters, no matter how vocal or principled, were vastly outnumbered by institutional inertia. The moral framework built over centuries had created a system resistant to change, adaptable to new territories, and justified through scripture, law, and tradition. In short, individual morality could coexist with systemic immorality. Clergy could be kind, charitable, or virtuous in practice, yet their actions rarely undermined the institution's reliance on slavery. Compassion existed alongside coercion, and the Church's authority remained intact. This moral compromise, embedded in practice and doctrine, would have profound consequences as European empires expanded beyond the continent. By the late 15th century, Europe had entered a new era of exploration and conquest. Ships sailed beyond familiar coastlines, carrying explorers, traders, and missionaries into uncharted lands. The Catholic Church, with centuries of precedent behind it, played a central role in these voyages. Its authority, moral reasoning, and bureaucratic structures followed Europeans wherever they went, shaping not only faith but labor and power dynamics. Africa was one of the first regions profoundly impacted. European powers established trading posts along the coast, seeking gold, spices, and other resources. Alongside commerce came the demand for labor. Indigenous peoples, and later Africans brought across the Atlantic, were subjected to systems of bondage that mirrored, amplified, and institutionalized the practices already developed in Europe. Church documents, particularly papal bulls, explicitly sanctioned the subjugation of non-Christian peoples. These letters framed conquest as both religious and moral. Non-Christians were depicted as heathens who could benefit spiritually from conversion. Obedience to Christian authority was framed as a duty, and for those who resisted, enslavement was justified. The logic was consistent with centuries of European precedent. Spiritual inclusion did not require earthly freedom. Religious orders became directly involved. Missionaries accompanied colonial expeditions, tasked with converting indigenous peoples to Christianity. Some clergy owned plantations or were investors in colonial enterprises. Church institutions profited from labor systems built on enslavement, sometimes arguing that the labor itself was an opportunity for spiritual salvation. Conversion became a tool of moral justification, even as freedom was denied. This period also saw the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. Africans were captured, sold, and transporting across the ocean in vast numbers. European powers developed the infrastructure of trade: ships, ports, markets, and financial networks. Clergy often participated, advised, or provided spiritual oversight. Papal authority and church blessing were invoked to legitimize the trade, even as critics within the church occasionally protested cruelty. At the same time, church moral reasoning continued to emphasize obedience and hierarchical order. Conversion to Christianity was celebrated, but it rarely carried legal or social emancipation. An enslaved person's soul could be claimed as equal in the eyes of God, but their body remained subject to control. Spiritual salvation was prioritized over earthly liberty, a pattern established over centuries in Europe, now exported globally. Colonial administrations reinforced this framework. Laws in the Americas codified slavery, often citing papal precedent or European custom. Enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples were legally denied freedom, while European colonists, many of whom were practicing Catholics, justified their actions through the Church's moral and legal teachings. Missionaries and clergy were asked to provide moral guidance, but systemic abolition was rarely on the agenda. Within church communities, debates continued. Some missionaries questioned the treatment of indigenous peoples or African slaves, advocating for improved conditions or protection against abuse. These voices were sometimes influential locally, resulting in regulations designed to mitigate suffering, yet they did not challenge the system of bondage itself. Ownership, coercion, and exploitation remained sanctioned at the highest levels. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the Church's global involvement in slavery was extensive. Monasteries, missions, and bishoprics around the world owned land, laborers, and plantations. Religious authority, moral sanction, and bureaucratic oversight combined to create a system that was efficient, profitable, and difficult to challenge. Spiritual care and social subjugation coexisted seamlessly, reflecting centuries of European precedent now applied globally. The consequences were profound. Millions of people were forced into labor far from home, enduring harsh conditions, family separations, and cultural dislocation. Spiritual inclusion could not offset physical bondage. Conversion could not undo chains. The Church's centuries-old framework, originally designed to regulate European estates, now structured the lives of people across continents. In this context, the Catholic Church was not merely a moral observer of European expansion. It was an active participant. Its authority legitimized conquest, its bureaucracy facilitated ownership, and its theology rationalized the subjugation of millions. The moral and legal precedents built over centuries in Europe had found new expression on a global scale, with consequences that would endure for generations. When Europeans reached the Americas, the Catholic Church arrived almost immediately, entwined with colonial administration. Missionaries followed conquistadors, settlers, and merchants, bringing religious authority alongside imperial power. The Church's presence was not neutral. It shaped how societies organized labor, regulated the treatment of enslaved peoples, and rationalized the use of forced work as morally permissible. Large tracts of land were claimed by colonial powers, and the Church often received donations, grants, or endowments that included not just the territory, but the people living there. Indigenous communities were coerced into labor systems under ecclesiastical supervision. Later, African slaves brought across the Atlantic were incorporated into the same system, bound to plantations, missions, or church estates. The Church provided moral and legal justification for this labor. Papal bulls and church decrees were cited by colonial authorities to legitimize enslavement. Clergy taught that enslaved individuals could gain spiritual salvation through obedience, baptism, and conversion, but earthly freedom remained optional, rarely granted, and often withheld entirely. Religious life was entwined with labor, turning spiritual instruction into a tool of social control. Monasteries, missions, and bishoprics became central nodes of the colonial economy. They oversaw plantations producing sugar, coffee, tobacco, and other cash crops. Enslaved labor was essential to these operations, sustaining both church wealth and the broader colonial system. In many cases, enslaved people performed grueling work under harsh conditions, monitored by church-appointed overseers who ensured that productivity and obedience were maintained. At the same time, the Church's moral authority shaped European perceptions of labor. Colonists were taught that coerced work was compatible with Christian virtue if conducted under religious oversight. The Church reinforced social hierarchies, portraying obedience as spiritually beneficial and submission as morally praiseworthy. Any resistance could be interpreted as defiance not only of social order, but of God's will. Some missionaries spoke out against abuse, advocating for fairer treatment or protection from extreme cruelty. These voices were occasionally influential in local communities. Regulations were enacted to limit the most egregious practices, such as overwork or corporal punishment. However, these measures rarely challenged the institution of slavery itself. Ownership, control, and forced labor remained legal and morally sanctioned by church authority. In parallel, church teachings shaped legal systems in the colonies. Colonial laws often mirrored the moral reasoning of papal decrees. Enslaved people were considered property, subject to both civil law and ecclesiastical oversight. Baptism, conversion, and participation in religious life were sometimes cited to ensure obedience, rather than to grant freedom. Spiritual inclusion coexisted with exploitation. The psychological impact of this system was profound. Enslaved individuals were encouraged to see submission as virtuous, obedience as holy, and suffering as spiritually beneficial. Spiritual instruction became a mechanism for enforcing control. By framing coercion in religious terms, the Church helped normalize a brutal economic system and muted moral questioning among colonists. Meanwhile, church institutions profited directly. Estates, plantations, and missions generated revenue that funded religious activity, education, and expansion. Enslaved labor underpinned the Church's global influence, ensuring that its spiritual authority was reinforced by tangible economic power. The institution's wealth, prestige, and reach grew alongside the expansion of bondage. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Church was fully embedded in transatlantic slavery. Its moral, legal, and administrative frameworks were deeply entwined with European colonial systems. Spiritual authority legitimized economic exploitation, moral reasoning rationalized labor control, and centuries of precedent made intervention rare. The Church's presence was both ideological and material, shaping the structure, operation, and endurance of slavery on a global scale. In this way, centuries of European moral reasoning and institutional practice, originally developed to manage domestic labor, became a blueprint for global coercion. The Church did not merely adapt to colonial systems, it actively reinforced them, creating a moral and organizational infrastructure that supported the transatlantic slave trade and the exploitation of millions of human lives. Across the Caribbean, South America, and parts of North America, the Catholic Church established estates and plantations that relied heavily on enslaved labor. From sugarcane fields in Brazil to coffee plantations in Central America, church institutions directly controlled the lives of thousands of enslaved individuals. These operations were organized with meticulous oversight, blending economic management with spiritual authority. Monasteries and missions often appointed overseers, sometimes clergy, sometimes lay brothers, to supervise labor. Workdays were structured around both agricultural cycles and religious observances. Enslaved people were required to rise early, complete physically demanding tasks, and attend church services or catechism lessons. Spiritual instruction was not incidental. It was a deliberate mechanism for reinforcing obedience and order. The Church's involvement in education and ritual further reinforced social control. Enslaved individuals were taught prayers, hymns, and Christian doctrine. They were baptized, instructed in sacraments, and integrated into parish life. Yet these spiritual practices coexisted with severe restrictions on freedom. Conversion was framed as a moral and spiritual good, but it rarely changed an individual's legal or social status. In effect, religious ritual became a tool to normalize labor, enforce hierarchy, and maintain institutional authority. Records from these estates reveal the systemic nature of control. Work obligations, punishments, and rewards were carefully documented. Failure to comply could result in fines, physical discipline, or extended labor duties. Participation in religious ceremonies, however, could be rewarded with small privileges, a symbolic reinforcement of obedience that tied spiritual favor to subjugation. The Church effectively wove morality into the labor system, making coercion appear both natural and righteous. Economic incentives reinforced this structure. Church estates produced commodities that were sold locally and exported globally, generating wealth that funded further expansion, construction, and religious activity. Enslaved labor was the backbone of this economic engine, allowing the Church to increase both its material power and spiritual influence. Profits from sugar, coffee, tobacco, and other goods funded cathedrals, seminaries, and missions, creating a cycle in which economic and spiritual authority mutually reinforced one another. At the same time, enslaved communities developed strategies for resilience. They preserved cultural traditions, created social networks, and sometimes found subtle ways to resist or negotiate the harsh demands imposed on them. These efforts, however, were always constrained by the Church's moral and administrative authority. Acts of defiance were met with punishment or reinterpretation through religious language, reinforcing the institution's control. Over decades and centuries, church-owned estates became models of global slavery. The systems developed were not limited to local practice. They influenced secular colonial policies and other religious orders. The combination of bureaucratic oversight, religious instruction, and moral justification created a durable framework, one that could persist across regions and generations. The long-term consequences were profound. Entire communities were uprooted and forced into labor systems where obedience was moralized and resistance was criminalized. Wealth accumulated for the Church and European elites, while enslaved people suffered under tightly controlled systems that merged physical coercion with spiritual manipulation. These dynamics laid the foundation for centuries of entrenched inequality and cultural disruption. By the 18th century, the Church had become fully enmeshed in global slavery. Its moral authority legitimized coercion, its wealth depended on labor exploitation, and its administrative systems ensured control over both people and property. Spiritual guidance, ritual participation, and religious education were intricately bound to the operation of forced labor, creating a system in which morality, obedience, and exploitation coexisted, often invisibly to the wider world. By the 18th century, cracks began to appear in the centuries-old framework that had allowed the Church to sanction slavery. The moral, theological, and legal systems that had justified bondage were increasingly questioned, both within the Church and in broader society. A growing number of voices began to ask difficult questions. Could Christianity truly condone the ownership of human beings? Did obedience to God require submission to human masters? Was spiritual salvation enough to justify the denial of freedom? Early abolitionist sentiment emerged in Europe among philosophers, theologians, and activists who challenged the prevailing assumptions about hierarchy, race, and morality. Figures like Bartolomé de las Casas, although controversial and imperfect in his views, highlighted the cruelty inflicted on indigenous peoples and argued for the moral imperative to protect human life. De las Casas and others became moral witnesses to the abuses that had long been normalized. Their writings, letters, and appeals to authority questioned the Church's complicity in systems of oppression. Within the Church itself, debates surfaced. Some clergy began to argue that enslaving people, even for spiritual purposes, was incompatible with true Christian morality. These discussions often revolved around principles of natural law, the inherent dignity of every human soul, and the tension between earthly labor and spiritual equality. Critics pointed out that conversion could not legitimize violence, coercion, or deprivation of freedom. Yet while these ideas gained traction in theory, they faced immense institutional resistance. Centuries of precedent, entrenched economic interest, and bureaucratic inertia made systemic change difficult. At the same time, economic and political shifts were beginning to weaken the foundations of church-sanctioned slavery. European powers were experiencing social, industrial, and intellectual transformations. The rise of Enlightenment thought emphasized reason, equality, and human rights. Philosophers debated liberty, justice, and the moral responsibilities of rulers and religious authorities. These ideas filtered into discussions within the Church, prompting some leaders to reconsider the ethical framework surrounding slavery. Despite these intellectual currents, progress was uneven. Local church authorities often maintained traditional practices, especially in colonies where labor systems were deeply entrenched. Attempts to protect or emancipate enslaved people were limited in scope and frequently undermined by economic pressures. Abolitionist arguments were acknowledged in principle, but rarely enforced in practice. The Church remained a powerful institution, capable of influencing morality, law, and public opinion, yet it struggled to reconcile centuries of precedent with emerging ideals of human rights. Individual clergy continued to act according to conscience, offering protection, spiritual guidance, or even manumission in isolated cases. These acts, though meaningful, were piecemeal. They could not overturn the systemic structures that had evolved over centuries. The Church's global involvement in slavery, from Europe to Africa to the Americas, remained largely intact, even as philosophical and moral criticism increased. In essence, Part 5 begins with tension, the Church's authority and tradition versus growing moral awareness and emerging human rights consciousness. The legacy of centuries of sanctioned slavery created inertia that slowed reform, even as moral imagination expanded. The groundwork for eventual abolition was being laid, but the Church's full embrace of freedom and equality would take decades, and in some cases centuries, to materialize. As moral criticism of slavery gained momentum in Europe and the Americas, the Catholic Church could not remain entirely silent. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, voices inside the Church began advocating for reform, though often cautiously, and always within the limits of institutional preservation. The Church faced a delicate balancing act, acknowledging the growing moral imperative against slavery while protecting centuries of wealth, authority, and tradition built upon coerced labor. Some popes issued letters urging moderation in the treatment of enslaved people. They condemned extreme cruelty, prohibited excessive punishment, and stressed the need for religious instruction. These directives were framed as moral obligations, not challenges to the institution of slavery itself. The Church emphasized that enslaved individuals were still property under law, but that their owners had spiritual responsibilities. Obedience, patience, and conversion were repeated themes, reinforcing the idea that spiritual well-being mattered even when bodily freedom remained restricted. In certain cases, selective manumission became an acceptable form of reform. Individual enslaved people were freed, sometimes as acts of charity or moral demonstration. Wealthy patrons or church administrators occasionally granted freedom to loyal servants or devout converts. These acts were celebrated within the Church as examples of Christian virtue, but they were isolated incidents. They did not alter the larger system, and the vast majority of enslaved individuals remained in bondage. The Church also responded strategically to secular abolitionist pressures. As European governments began to outlaw slavery or regulate colonial labor, Church authorities adapted by creating frameworks that complied with legal reforms without fully relinquishing economic interests. This often meant restructuring estates, introducing wage labor alongside coerced work, or emphasizing religious instruction over labor liberation. In effect, the Church's reforms were designed to maintain authority, wealth, and influence, while appearing morally responsive. At the same time, debate persisted within Church institutions. Some clergy argued for full emancipation, citing the inherent dignity of all human beings and the incompatibility of slavery with Christian ethics. These reformers often faced institutional resistance. Their influence was limited by the Church's hierarchical structure, entrenched traditions, and dependence on the economic benefits of labor. Even when their arguments were persuasive, implementation was inconsistent and localized. The result was a pattern of compromise. Reforms improved conditions in specific cases, addressed some abuses, and signaled moral awareness, but they did not dismantle systemic bondage. Spiritual care, moral exhortation, and selective manumission became tools for mitigating criticism without threatening centuries of institutional power. The Church could claim moral progress while preserving economic advantage and social hierarchy. This period illustrates the tension between conscience and institutional inertia. The Church's involvement in slavery was centuries old, deeply intertwined with global expansion and wealth accumulation. Reformers within the institution sought justice, but their efforts were constrained by precedent, bureaucracy, and the very systems they hoped to change. Moral imagination expanded, but structural change lagged far behind. By the mid-19th century, these tensions would intensify as secular abolition movements gained legal and political success. Governments, philosophers, and human rights advocates increasingly demanded systemic abolition, challenging centuries of Church-sanctioned labor practices. The Church, with its dual legacy of moral authority and historical complicity, was forced to confront the limits of spiritual guidance when faced with calls for full liberation. In short, Church responses during this period were incremental, selective, and constrained. They reflected an ongoing struggle to reconcile moral conscience with centuries of entrenched economic and spiritual power. Partial reforms and manumissions softened the edges of slavery, but left its structures largely intact, demonstrating the challenge of dismantling a system that had been woven into the Church's identity for generations. By the 19th century, growing international pressure and widespread abolitionist movements forced the Catholic Church to take a more definitive stance on slavery. Popes began issuing encyclicals and public statements condemning the practice, reflecting centuries of moral debate and the Church's evolving understanding of human dignity. Pope Gregory XVI in 1839 issued the famous apostolic letter in Supremo Apostolatus, which denounced the slave trade and forbade clergy from participating in the buying or selling of enslaved individuals. He condemned the inhumanity of the transatlantic trade and emphasized that all humans are created in the image of God. The letter marked a significant moral shift. For the first time, the Church publicly and unequivocally condemned slavery as incompatible with Christian ethics. Subsequent papal statements reinforced this position. Pope Leo XIII, Pope Pius IX, and others reiterated the Church's opposition to human bondage, framing it as a moral and spiritual wrong. These declarations were echoed in Catholic teachings and pastoral guidance, signaling to clergy and laity alike that slavery was no longer morally defensible. The Church had moved from tolerance and selective reform to formal condemnation. Yet the reality on the ground often lagged behind doctrine. While papal statements prohibited participation in the slave trade and condemned the ownership of human beings, enforcement was uneven. Some religious orders continued to operate estates that relied on coerced labor, either because of local circumstances, bureaucratic inertia, or the challenges of disentangling long-established systems. Compliance depended heavily on local leadership and interpretation, leading to a patchwork of implementation across different regions. Moreover, centuries of precedent had left deep cultural and institutional inertia. Many church-run institutions in the Americas and Europe were financially dependent on labor systems that had existed for generations. Even with official condemnation, disentangling these economic structures required time, resources, and the willingness of church authorities to challenge entrenched interests. Spiritual guidance had shifted, but economic and social realities moved more slowly. Despite these challenges, the Church's moral authority began to influence broader social norms. Clergy who had previously justified or tolerated slavery found themselves under increasing pressure to align with official doctrine. Religious education emphasized the equality and dignity of all people, and moral language shifted from tolerance to explicit denunciation. Over time, this contributed to the wider acceptance of abolitionist principles within Catholic communities. The transition was not immediate or flawless. Instances of residual coercion, exploitation, or moral rationalization persisted, but the shift in official teaching created a foundation for lasting change. The Church now provided both moral leadership and institutional guidance, signaling that slavery in any form was incompatible with Christian ethics. By the late 19th century, the Catholic Church had formally repudiated the centuries-old justifications for ownership of human beings. Papal encyclicals, theological discourse, and moral instruction converged to make clear that spiritual salvation could not be used to rationalize bondage. The gap between doctrine and practice remained a challenge, but the moral framework for abolition had been firmly established. This moment represents the culmination of centuries of tension between institutional authority, economic interests, and evolving moral consciousness. The Church, which had once sanctioned and profited from slavery, had moved to condemn it openly, demonstrating the capacity for moral reflection, reform, and accountability, even after centuries of complicity. It marked the beginning of a new chapter, in which the Church could leverage its moral authority to support human dignity rather than suppress it. The Catholic Church's centuries-long involvement in slavery left a profound and complex legacy, one that continues to resonate today. Understanding this history requires grappling with contradictions. An institution devoted to spiritual guidance that simultaneously sanctioned coercion, promoted obedience over freedom, and justified exploitation through theology and law. The moral and institutional tensions of the past offer valuable lessons for modern society. One of the clearest legacies is the intertwining of moral authority with material power. The Church wielded spiritual influence to justify social and economic hierarchies, often at the expense of human dignity. By presenting obedience and submission as virtues, the institution shaped not only the behavior of enslaved people, but also the moral imagination of the broader society. Generations grew accustomed to accepting structural injustice as divinely sanctioned or morally neutral. This legacy challenges us to reflect on the ways institutions today balance authority, morality, and power. The Church's history shows that moral teachings can be used to legitimize exploitation if they are not coupled with accountability and critical oversight. Spiritual authority, without ethical checks, can create systems that endure far longer than their initial justifications might suggest. At the same time, the history of church-sanctioned slavery demonstrates the resilience of human agency. Enslaved people maintained their cultural identities, spiritual practices, and social networks even under harsh conditions. They found ways to survive, resist, and assert dignity within oppressive systems. Their perseverance reminds us that morality and power are not solely determined by institutions. Human beings continue to exercise agency, creativity, and resilience, even in the face of systemic injustice. The Church's eventual moral reckoning also offers a model for institutional reflection and reform. After centuries of complicity, the formal condemnation of slavery in the 19th century shows that institutions can change, even when entrenched interests and historical precedent are deeply entrenched. The process was slow, incremental, and uneven, but it illustrates the possibility of moral evolution. Institutions can confront uncomfortable truths, adapt, and align practice with ethical principles, though it often requires sustained pressure, moral vision, and courageous individuals advocating for change. Another enduring consequence lies in the global patterns of inequality and cultural disruption created by church-sanctioned slavery. The use of enslaved labor in Europe, Africa, and the Americas fueled wealth accumulation, influenced migration patterns, and shaped social hierarchies. The effects of these systems were long-lasting. Economic advantages persisted for some, while generations of people were denied freedom, opportunity, and autonomy. Recognizing this historical reality is essential for understanding modern social and economic disparities, and for fostering reconciliation and justice. Finally, this history prompts reflection on the role of faith in moral reasoning. The Church's experience illustrates the dual potential of religion. It can inspire compassion, justice, and ethical reflection, but it can also rationalize oppression when combined with authority and self-interest. The lesson is clear: moral vigilance, transparency, and accountability are crucial whenever belief intersects with power. In essence, the legacy of church-sanctioned slavery is not just a historical fact. It is a lens through which we can examine the interplay of morality, authority, and human rights. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, recognize the long-term consequences of institutional decisions, and commit to principles that prioritize dignity, justice, and freedom for all. The story of the Church's involvement in slavery is not just an institutional history. It is a mirror for human morality, responsibility, and conscience. On a personal level, it reminds us that good intentions, even when guided by faith, can be compromised by authority, tradition, or self-interest. Clergy who acted with compassion often mitigated suffering, but without challenging the system itself, their efforts could only soften the edges rather than dismantle oppression. Collectively, the Church's actions highlight the moral weight of institutions. When organizations possess spiritual, social, or economic power, their choices ripple far beyond individual actions. Policies, doctrines, and legal frameworks influence generations, shaping social norms, moral perceptions, and material realities. The Church's sanctioning of slavery demonstrates that institutional authority can perpetuate injustice for centuries if unchecked by critical reflection or accountability. Acknowledging this history is essential. The Church bears a responsibility not only to recognize its past complicity, but also to educate future generations. Understanding the consequences of church-sanctioned slavery, the displacement, suffering, and enduring inequality, is a moral imperative. Silence or omission risks repeating patterns of harm, while transparency fosters reconciliation, accountability, and moral growth. There is also a broader lesson for all institutions, religious or secular. Authority must always be exercised with vigilance, ethical clarity, and respect for human dignity. Even well-intentioned frameworks can justify exploitation if they go unexamined. The interplay between moral teachings, economic interest, and structural power requires constant scrutiny, debate, and, when necessary, reform. The Church's eventual condemnation of slavery shows that change is possible, but it also illustrates the cost of delayed action, generations of suffering, and systemic injustice. On a human level, this history emphasizes empathy and moral courage. It underscores the need to question prevailing norms, challenge abuses of power, and advocate for those whose voices are marginalized. The lives of enslaved people and the courage of those who resisted or sought reform provide enduring examples of resilience, agency, and the pursuit of justice, even in the most constrained circumstances. Finally, this reflection bridges history with the present. The moral lessons from church-sanctioned slavery are not confined to centuries past. They remain relevant wherever authority, belief, and power intersect. They challenge us to examine our institutions, question inherited assumptions, and commit to ethical principles that prioritize freedom, dignity, and equality. The history of the Church and slavery is, in this sense, a moral compass, a cautionary tale, and a guide for the ongoing struggle to align authority with justice. The history of the Catholic Church and slavery is a story of contradiction, complexity, and eventual moral reckoning. For centuries, the Church sanctioned, regulated, and profited from systems of bondage, blending spiritual authority with economic power. It justified ownership of human beings through theology, canon law, and moral reasoning, creating a framework that spanned Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Obedience, conversion, and spiritual instruction were emphasized, while freedom, bodily autonomy, and human dignity were subordinated to institutional authority. Yet this history is not only one of complicity, it is also a story of transformation. Over centuries, debate, moral reflection, and the courage of reformers within and outside the Church gradually shifted attitudes. By the 19th century, official doctrine condemned slavery, papal encyclicals denounced the transatlantic trade, and the moral authority of the Church began to support, rather than undermine, human freedom. This transition was slow, uneven, and incomplete in practice, but it demonstrates the possibility of institutional self-reflection and moral evolution. The lessons are profound. History shows how institutions, even those devoted to moral guidance, can become entangled with injustice when tradition, power, and economic interest outweigh ethical responsibility. It also highlights the importance of moral courage, both individual and collective, in challenging entrenched systems. The actions of those who advocated for fair treatment, limited cruelty, or emancipation, though small in scale, reveal the persistent human capacity for conscience and ethical action. The Church's journey also reminds us of the enduring impact of systemic injustice. Centuries of sanctioned slavery reshaped societies, economies, and cultures around the world. Generations suffered under coerced labor, and the consequences of these systems continue to resonate today. Acknowledging this history is not an exercise in blame alone. It is an opportunity for learning, accountability, and fostering justice in the present and future. Ultimately, this story is a cautionary tale and a guide. It challenges us to critically examine authority, question inherited norms, and recognize the moral consequences of institutional decisions. It underscores the necessity of aligning power with ethics, belief with action, and authority with responsibility. And it celebrates the resilience and agency of those who endured oppression, reminding us that even in the darkest chapters of history, courage, conscience, and the pursuit of justice endure. As we reflect on this history, we see that morality is not static, and institutions are not beyond reform. The Church's path from complicity to condemnation illustrates both the dangers of moral complacency and the possibilities of transformation. It is a story that calls on all of us, individuals, communities, and institutions, to confront uncomfortable truths, learn from the past, and strive toward a future where human dignity, freedom, and justice are upheld for all.